Hello everyone. Welcome to today's story, where James, a wealthy man, is desperately searching for the woman he loves, Diep, after she mysteriously disappeared. Meanwhile, Diep, alone in the wilderness, is fighting fear and exhaustion, holding on to one hope: to be reunited with James. But here's the shocking twist. James's mother has just passed away while he still hasn't found her, and no one knows if Diep will survive to return. Stay tuned to find out the unexpected outcome. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another thrilling story. James sat by his mother's bedside, the silence of the room pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. His mother had passed away after a long battle with illness. The memories of her final words urging him to find Diep, now weighed on his heart. She had always been his rock, his guide, and now she was gone, leaving him adrift in a sea of grief and uncertainty. He couldn't stop thinking about the last thing she said. "You have to find her, James. Love is the only thing that can save you." Those words echoed in his mind, but now, without her, he felt lost. He touched her cold hand one last time, tears streaming down his face. The sense of loss was overwhelming, and for a moment, he questioned his ability to keep going. How could he face the world without her? How could he keep searching for Diep when his world had fallen apart? James stood up slowly, his body aching with fatigue and sorrow. The room felt emptier now, devoid of the warmth his mother had once filled it with. His heart felt heavy, as if the weight of his grief was too much to bear. But he couldn't stop now, not when Diep was still out there, somewhere. His mother's voice rang in his ears, urging him to keep going, to keep searching, to keep fighting for the love they had. "I'll find her, Mom, I promise," he whispered, though doubt clouded his mind. But he knew there was no turning back. He had to keep going. Diep stumbled through the dense forest, the weight of exhaustion pressing heavily on her limbs. Her stomach growled in protest, but she ignored it, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The path ahead was uncertain, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and overgrown plants. She was alone in this vast, uncharted wilderness, but her determination burned brighter than any fear. With each step, her mind drifted to James. The memory of his face, the warmth of his touch, kept her moving forward. She could still feel the echo of his love, even across the distance and through the danger that surrounded her. She had promised herself she would return to him, and no matter how much the journey tested her strength, she couldn't give up. Diep's body ached, her muscles protesting with each movement, but she knew she couldn't stop. The pain was temporary. The thought of James waiting for her was permanent. She needed to find him. She needed to be with him again. The sounds of the forest, distant calls of birds, the rustling of leaves seemed to mock her solitude. She paused, wiping sweat from her brow, and glanced around. The forest seemed endless, the trees towering above her like silent sentinels. Was she lost? Or was this just another test? Another challenge to prove that she was worthy of their love? A small flicker of hope ignited within her. "I will find you, James," she whispered, the words barely audible above the wind. "I will come home." James and Officer Ly stood at the edge of the construction zone, the air thick with tension. The area was quiet, too quiet for comfort. The overcast sky cast a dim light over the desolate surroundings, and James could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing on him. Every part of him wanted to run, to dive into the unknown, but he knew better than to act recklessly. His mind was scattered, torn between his grief and the burning need to find Diep. Officer Ly, ever the calm presence, looked over at James. "We're getting close, but be careful, James. This area is full of dangerous people. The longer we stay here, the more risks we take." James nodded, the cold feeling of fear settling deep within him. He had faced danger before, but nothing compared to the fear of losing Diep. He clenched his fists, determination flooding him despite the doubt. "Do you really think she's here?" James asked, his voice thick with emotion. The doubt in his tone was clear, but his desire to believe was stronger. Ly studied him for a moment before responding. "It's possible, but we need to be cautious. The criminals here are dangerous. I can't promise you everything will go smoothly." James stared into the distance, the thought of Diep fading deeper into the unknown. The idea that she might still be out there, waiting, was all that kept him moving forward. He had to believe. "Let's move," James said, his voice resolute. "I can't wait any longer. She's out there and I need to find her." The forest seemed to stretch endlessly before Diep, the once promising path now tangled in dense underbrush. Her body felt as if it was being pulled by invisible forces, each step becoming heavier, more laborious than the last. The taste of bitterness lingered on her lips, a mix of hunger, thirst, and fear. She had been alone for so long, each day a fight for survival. Her energy was slipping, but there was one thing she refused to let go of: hope. Diep paused for a moment, leaning against a tree, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked up at the sky, a patch of blue barely visible through the canopy of trees. It felt like a lifetime ago that she and James had been together. The memory of his face, his voice, still haunted her every thought. She could still hear him calling her name in her mind, urging her to keep going, to not give up. "I can't stop now," Diep whispered to herself, her voice hoarse. "I promised I'd come back." The wind rustled the leaves above her, as if the forest itself was responding to her words, reminding her that the journey was not yet over. There was still a chance, a fragile thread of hope that she had to hold on to. She stood up, wiped her tears away, and took another step, pushing through the exhaustion, the doubt, and the fear. With every step, the forest seemed to close in around her, but in her heart, she knew she was getting closer, closer to him. She had to believe that. "I will find you, James," she murmured, her voice stronger this time. "I'm coming back." The forest was silent now, except for the distant call of birds and the occasional crackling of twigs underfoot. James and Officer Ly moved cautiously through the overgrown path, their every step deliberate, careful. The air was thick with tension, and every rustle in the trees felt like a threat. James's mind raced, torn between the instinct to rush forward and the caution that Ly kept urging. They had followed the lead, the small clue that Diep might be somewhere near here, but the uncertainty hung over them like a cloud. James' heart pounded in his chest, and the ache of loss from his mother's passing was still raw. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders, but his love for Diep kept him moving. He couldn't afford to fail now, not after everything. He had promised himself and her that he would find her. "James, stay alert," Officer Ly whispered, his voice low but sharp. "We're close. There's no turning back now." James nodded, his jaw tight, I know, let's just find her." As they rounded a corner, the sight of a small clearing in the trees caught James's eye. His heart skipped a beat, and he took a step forward, his breath catching in his throat. There, lying on the ground, almost hidden by the foliage, was a figure. It was Diep. She was unconscious, her body bruised, pale, but still breathing. James rushed to her side, dropping to his knees. His heart raced as he gently touched her face. She was cold to the touch, but alive. "Diep," he whispered urgently, shaking her slightly. "Diep, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, weak but filled with recognition. "James," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "I found you," James whispered, his voice choked with emotion, tears welling in his eyes. "I found you." Diep's eyes fluttered, struggling to stay open as she stared up at James. The world felt like it was spinning, but the sight of him, there, kneeling beside her, his hands trembling as they held her, was the one thing that grounded her. She could hardly believe it. The pain, the exhaustion, the fear, all of it seemed to fade away for a moment. "James," she whispered again, barely able to form the words. Her voice was faint, but it was enough for him to hear. "I'm here, Diep," James said softly, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. His heart was beating loudly in his chest, the relief flooding through him like a wave. He had found her. Despite everything, despite his own grief, the dangers, the distance, they had finally found each other. But even in this fragile moment of reunion, the reality of the situation hit him. Diep was weak, her body battered from the journey, and she was still far from being out of danger. "We need to get you out of here," James said, his voice firm with determination. "You've been through so much. I won't let you go through this alone anymore." Diep tried to smile, but it was weak, and she could feel the dizziness overwhelming her again. I thought I'd lost you, James," she whispered, her breath shallow. "I didn't know if I'd survived this, but I kept thinking of you." James kissed her forehead gently, his heart breaking for everything she had endured. "I promised I would find you, and I kept that promise. Now, let's go home, Diep, let's go home together." He gently lifted her into his arms, his strength steady despite the weight of the world bearing down on him. They weren't free of danger yet, but in this moment, they were together. And that was enough. The path back felt like an eternity. With each step, James could feel Diep's fragile body resting against him, the weight of her exhaustion pulling at both of them. The forest that once felt so dense and suffocating now seemed a little more forgiving, like nature itself had granted them mercy. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting the world in hues of orange and purple. It was a moment of peace, but James knew it wouldn't last. Their journey wasn't over yet. Diep stirred slightly in his arms, her breath steady but still shallow. "James." Her voice was weak, but there was a sense of peace in it now, as if she trusted that everything would be okay. "I'm here, Diep," he whispered, glancing down at her, his heart full of gratitude for this second chance. "I'm sorry," she muttered, her words trailing off. "I never wanted to put you through this." James shook his head gently, his grip tightening around her. "No, don't apologize. You didn't choose this. We're in this together now, that's all that matters." But even as James reassured her, the storm within him had not passed. The weight of his mother's death still lingered heavily. and the memories of her final words haunted him. He couldn't help but wonder if she had known this moment, this reunion, was the last piece of his heart that he needed to heal. As the light faded completely, the two of them found their way out of the forest, slowly but surely. The familiar sight of the small village on the horizon filled James with a bittersweet relief. They were almost home. They were almost safe. But home was no longer just the place they had left behind. It was now each other. And that made the journey worth everything. James, a grieving son, is on a desperate search for his missing love, Diep, who is fighting for survival in the wilderness. After losing his mother, who urged him to find Diep, James is driven by love and loss. Meanwhile, Diep, exhausted and lost, continues her perilous journey, clinging to hope. After a tense search, James finally finds Diep, weak and unconscious in the forest. Their reunion is emotional, but Diep is still in danger. James promises to never let her go again, and with determination, he carries her through the forest, slowly making their way home. Despite the obstacles, their love and the promise of a future together keep them going.